The hidden purpose of birth certificates, the records that erased Tartaria. What if your birth certificate was never just a document, but part of something much bigger, something designed to reshape history and redefine who you are from the moment you are born? Birth registration, as we know it today, did not always exist, and in many countries, large-scale centralized records only became common between the late 1800s and early 1900s. Right around the same period when governments expanded control, standardized identities, and began tracking populations in ways that had never been done before. But then comes the question that almost no one asks. Why did this change happen so suddenly across different parts of the world within such a short window of time? On one side, historians will tell you this was simply modernization, the natural evolution of bureaucracy in growing nations. On the other side, there are researchers who point to something else, something that doesn't quite fit neatly into official explanations. Massive buildings across Europe, Russia, and even parts of America, structures that appear far too advanced, far too uniform, and in some cases, far too large for the populations that supposedly built them at the time. Entire city layouts that seem pre-planned on a scale that raises eyebrows. Old maps, some of them dated between the 16th and 18th centuries, that label vast regions as Tartaria, a name that today has almost completely disappeared from mainstream historical narratives. Was it just a vague geographic label used by Europeans for unknown lands as traditional history claims? Or was it something more organized, something that later had to be redefined, renamed, or even erased? Because if history was rewritten, even partially, then documents like birth certificates might not just record people. They might anchor them into a new version of reality. If birth certificates became widespread during a very specific period in history, then the next logical step is to understand what else was happening at the same time. Because systems like this rarely appear in isolation, they usually arrive as part of something much larger. Between the late 1800s and early 1900s, governments around the world began reorganizing society in ways that had never been seen before. Creating centralized records, issuing standardized identification, and building massive administrative structures capable of tracking millions of people with increasing precision. This was the era of censuses becoming more detailed, of passports becoming more common, of national registries being formalized, and of institutions gaining the ability to define, not just observe, the individual. Why was there such a strong push to register every single person from birth? Because before this period, identity was far more local, often tied to community, family, or church records, and in many cases, people lived entire lives without ever being part of a centralized national database. From the moment you are born, you are assigned a name, recorded by the state, and given an official existence that can be tracked, verified, and, if necessary, controlled. Some researchers argue that this shift represents more than administrative efficiency. They suggest it marks the creation of a dual identity: the physical human being and the legal identity recognized by institutions. Your legal identity is the one that pays taxes, signs contracts, holds property, and interacts with every formal system in society, while the actual human behind it exists almost as a secondary layer operating through that constructed profile. If a system was introduced to redefine identity on a global scale, then it becomes important to ask what that system replaced. And when you combine that with the idea that entire regions, once labeled differently, like Tartaria on historical maps, were later reclassified or erased from mainstream narratives, a pattern begins to emerge. One that suggests not just evolution, but restructuring. but it does show that they are part of a much larger transformation, one that changed how humans are identified, recorded, and integrated into society. And if that transformation followed the disappearance or reinterpretation of entire pieces of history, then the connection becomes difficult to ignore. If the idea of a lost or redefined civilization sounds hard to accept, the first place most researchers point to is not stories, but maps, because maps are physical records, created, printed, and preserved long before the internet, long before modern conspiracy theories even existed. There are multiple historical maps dating from the 16th to the 18th century, produced by European cartographers that label vast regions of Asia and beyond with a single name, Tartaria. Some of them come from respected mapmakers preserved in national libraries, museums, and university collections. The name Tartaria was used repeatedly across different maps and different countries. According to mainstream history, Tartaria was not a unified empire, but rather a broad, generic term used by Europeans to describe large, mostly unknown territories inhabited by various nomadic groups across Central and Northern Asia. If it was just a vague label, why does it appear so consistently across different mapmakers, often covering enormous areas with defined borders? Why do some maps seem to treat it almost like a single entity rather than a scattered collection of tribes? And perhaps the most important question of all, why did the term disappear? Because as you move into the 19th century, the name Tartaria begins to vanish from maps, replaced by more specific national identities like Russia, China, and other modern states. Officially, this is explained as improved geographic knowledge as exploration increased and regions became better understood. Because this disappearance happens during the same general period when systems of control, like centralized records and birth registration, were expanding rapidly. If maps raise questions, then architecture makes those questions harder to ignore. Because unlike drawings on paper, buildings are physical, they exist in the real world. They can be measured, analyzed, and compared, and across multiple countries there are structures that seem out of place. Massive buildings from the 18th and 19th centuries with intricate designs, enormous columns, advanced symmetry, and construction details that, according to some observers, appear too sophisticated for the technology and workforce officially attributed to them at the time. You can find them in cities across Europe, in parts of Russia, and even in the United States. Old courthouses, train stations, government buildings, museums. Structures that look almost identical in style, even when separated by thousands of kilometers. Mainstream explanations say this is simply the result of architectural movements, like neoclassicism, where designers were inspired by ancient Greece and Rome, replicating those styles using the tools and knowledge available during industrial expansion. But critics argue that the scale and speed of construction don't always match the official timelines. Some of these buildings appear in historical records almost fully formed, with limited documentation of the construction process itself. In certain cases, photographs from the 1800s show massive structures already standing. While the surrounding cities still look underdeveloped, this contrast raises eyebrows. Because building something enormous is one thing. Building it before the surrounding infrastructure even exists is something else entirely. Then there's another detail that often gets mentioned. Many of these buildings were later repurposed. Structures that supposedly began as one function, like exhibition halls or administrative centers, were later converted into courthouses, schools, or government offices. So, when some researchers connect these structures to the idea of Tartaria, they are not pointing to one building, but to a global consistency that they believe deserves closer examination. Because if these structures were part of something that came before, something later absorbed into new national identities, then the narrative of continuous linear history starts to crack. And once that crack appears, even slightly, it opens the door to a much bigger possibility. That what we see today may not be the full story of how our world was built. Basis point the pieces start to form a pattern, not a conclusion, but a pattern that keeps appearing in different forms. Across maps, architecture, and historical timelines that don't always align as neatly as we're told. And this is where one of the most controversial ideas enters the conversation. The idea of a reset. Some researchers believe that sometime between the late 1700s and mid-1800s, something happened on a global scale, something disruptive enough to break continuity, erase records, and allow for a restructuring of society under new systems. They don't all agree on what that event was. Some point to large-scale wars that may have been more destructive than officially recorded. Others mention unexplained fires that wiped out major cities across different countries within relatively short periods of time. There are also references to what's often called mud floods, a theory suggesting that parts of older cities were buried or partially submerged, leaving behind structures that appear lower than their original ground level. Now, here's where it's important to separate what is documented from what is interpreted. There were, in fact, massive fires in cities like Chicago, London, and San Francisco. Those events are real, recorded, and studied. Entire sections of cities were destroyed and later rebuilt. But the interpretation that these events were part of a coordinated or connected global reset is where mainstream history strongly disagrees. Still, for those who follow this line of thought, the timing raises questions. Because many of these destructive events occurred during the same general period when new systems were being introduced. New governments were consolidating power, and new ways of recording and defining people were becoming standardized. That, what we call modernization, may have actually been reconstruction. That, what we see as the natural rise of nations could, in part, be the reorganization of something that came before. And if that were even partially true, then the role of documents like birth certificates begins to look very different. Because instead of simply recording individuals within an existing system, they would represent the integration of individuals into a newly established order. Again, there is no single piece of evidence that proves a global reset happened in the way these theories describe. And when those elements are placed side by side, they create a narrative that, at the very least, invites deeper questioning. After everything we've explored, from the old maps that once labeled vast regions as Tartaria to the buildings that seem to appear in history already complete, and the possibility that parts of the past were not simply lost but reorganized, the final question shifts from curiosity to implication. Because if something on that scale was altered, then the world that followed would need structure. Not just new borders or new names, but a system capable of redefining identity itself. One that could quietly organize every individual into a new version of reality without resistance, without confusion, and without memory of what came before. And this is where the birth certificate stops looking like a simple document and starts looking like part of that structure. Because it does not just record your existence. It assigns you a place inside a system that was already fully built before you arrived, connecting you immediately to governments, laws, financial systems, and databases that operate continuously across generations. When you consider this alongside the disappearance of Tartaria from maps, not as proof but as a pattern, the interpretation becomes harder to ignore. Because if entire regions could be renamed and absorbed into new national identities, then every new person entering that system would also need to be aligned with it from the very beginning. In that context, the birth certificate becomes more than administrative. It becomes foundational, a tool that ensures that no matter what existed before, every new life begins already integrated into the current structure, without questioning its origin and without access to any alternative framework. This does not prove that Tartaria was a lost global civilization, and it does not confirm that history was deliberately erased. But it does reveal something undeniable about the present, which is that the system we live in is precise, consistent, and universal in the way it defines human identity. And that brings us back to the central idea of this video, because the hidden purpose of birth certificates may not be something officially stated. But when viewed through the lens of historical gaps, renamed territories, and possible resets, it begins to look less like a neutral record and more like a mechanism of continuity. A way to ensure that whatever the past may have been, every new generation starts inside the same controlled narrative, already defined, already recorded, and already part of a system that never needs to explain where it truly began.